Happy Monday, everybody. How's it going?
It's going well. Happy Monday, Joe. Welcome, Max.
Hey, what's up, Max?
Hey, thanks for having me here. It's great to be here.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, it's Labor Day, but I figured we'd do a show anyway because why not? So,
I
yeah.
mean, a lot of this show will be about the free labor of open source, right? So we can draw the connection there.
Yeah, perfect.
Wait a second here. Hold on a second.
Okay.
It says this event was canceled by LinkedIn. Wait a second here.
Okay.
Oh, you got to be fucking kidding me.
I wasn't
Um,
seeing it on LinkedIn, so I don't know what happened. Okay.
Huh. All right. Well, I guess we'll just continue, and it'll be on YouTube. Actually,
Okay.
no.
We'll just.
It says it's live right now. Maybe it's just a bug with StreamYard. So anyway,
Okay.
yeah, we are most certainly live there. I wonder how long this will last. Anyway, cool. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, awesome. Well, anyway, for the audience who don't know who you are, Max, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. So back in the day, I didn't know what I wanted to do for a career, and I flitted around a few different ideas, including design and like architecture and science, but never even considered programming. It was a hobby I had, right? And I always considered it kind of like a toy thing. I think partly because I was born in '81, right? And programming at that point hadn't proven itself as like the future, even though I really enjoyed it. So I went off to become a scientist. I got a degree in chemistry and I did a year in chemistry. And I discovered that I really hated chemistry, actually, and that I'd made a huge mistake. And so I fell into this depressed funk where I like didn't really go to work. And I installed Linux on my home computer and discovered open source and discovered all these open source communities that were doing like interesting things, and like it fitted what I really wanted to do in my life, which is like I wanted to try and make a difference with something. And that was what depressed me about my chemistry lab experience, was that I realized that this like crappy piece of instrumentation that I was day to day measuring the surface tension of these chemicals on was like going to be my career. Like I was going to be like 60 something, and like maybe I'd have a few papers about how I'd improve how surface tension forms in like some set of chemicals. I was like, I couldn't see how I could do anything with that. So I got into open source, made a few apps, and quit the chemistry job, moved back in with my parents until they kicked me out and told me to go get a job. Uh, and they really didn't see what I was doing as being anything that was interesting or like really worthy of me. But I managed to get myself a job with a London startup. It's like 2007, Last Femme. They did music, social music, and it was like the beginning of Web 2, round about then. And as a result, managed to get myself into the industry via open source, essentially. And you know, I love open source, and I just kept doing it. So like one of those days, I was complaining to one of my coworkers about the state of package management on Mac, uh, and like Mac at that time was just about becoming like the choice for developers. Up until then, a lot of developers used Linux. A lot of developers used Windows.
Yeah.
And Linux was more the kind of choice for like the Web 2 devs, but like Mac was Unix with a pretty layer on top, a much prettier layer. I quit Linux one week when my Wi-Fi drivers just stopped when I upgraded the kernel, and I didn't have an internet connection to fix them with, and so like it took me several days of like cycling back and forth to the library for the free internet to like try and debug what I was having problems with at home. And I was like, this isn't any good. And I realized the benefit of having like a vendor that assured some sort of quality layer. And Apple really appealed to me on a design centric sort of fashion. So I got there relatively early, and thus when I created Homebrew, uh, what is now widely considered the package management choice for
Yep.
Mac, it was just the timing was perfect, and so it became this like enormous project. And yeah, well, it's the rest of my career started then.
What were the shortcomings of Mac ports? I remember Mac ports was kind of big for a few years, but obviously it's kind of fallen by the wayside now.
Yeah, well, MacPorts still exists. D- Showing the way that open source that has value just continues to be there, even if like other competitors emerge. Like when I first started getting people like contributing to Homebrew, I remember like our tagline for a bit was MacPorts driving you to drink. Try Homebrew.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, but after a few years, when we obviously had like one such, someone like opened a pull request to remove it, saying it's kind of rubbing salt in the wound at this point, which
Oh.
is true. But like also, open source used to have more of this sort of fun edge, and that was part of what was going on there.
Hmm.
But MacPorts, it was pretty good, but part of the problem was it compiled from source. Um, and it compiled everything. So it just
Yep.
imagined that the stuff that Apple published with the Mac didn't exist. So you'd compile libc and up,
Mm.
and like macOS is what 10, 15 gigabytes. So you're compiling like 10, 15 gigabytes of base libraries before you can finally compile that tool you actually wanted. With Homebrew, I just said, okay, everything that Apple provides, we'll just use that, and then we'll just build on top of that.
Hmm.
So even though we also compiled from source for a long time, it was much, much quicker. So that was the biggest issue with Mac ports. Otherwise, Homebrew won, I think, because I really concentrated on the user experience and the design. And that came from the fact that I almost did design as a career. I always was thinking about how things worked. And I really copied like Apple's lead on a lot of the pieces. And so Hacker News found it after a few months, and they loved the little details I put into everything. So it just kept getting to the top of Hacker News for like several weeks on end. And even back then, Hacker News was an enormous source of traffic. So Homebrew has probably had the most unique contributors of any project ever.
Mm.
It's hard to think of another project that probably did, and that's partly because I designed Homebrew to be so easy to contribute to, which is another reason it succeeded.
Yeah, we were kind of talking about this before the show kicked off, and that is the problem. I think it is fair to call it a problem of companies just using open source without really contributing anything back. In the case of Homebrew, how were you able to build such a big contributor community? And did you see companies actually jumping in and making contributions?
Yeah, so the way it was, the way the community develops is nowadays I think it's several reasons. Like partly because I was one of the first projects to really use GitHub's social
Mm.
features. So Homebrew was the biggest project on GitHub for years. So it was
Wow.
2009, and GitHub had only been out like a couple of years at that point. It was still not that big. People were starting to choose it, but it was definitely getting chosen for open source a lot. And I used the way it was so easy to fork, contribute, pull requests like very effectively, and they used this as a case study for a long time in like how to use GitHub effectively. So yeah, like GitHub success, Homebrew was success on that, and I made it super easy. Like so many open source projects and projects in general, like contributing is the last thing in the README, and if it's there at all, and the details of how to do it aren't very clear. You need like prior knowledge on what tooling to use, and even then it can be tricky. Like I remember with a lot of old package managers, you had to install an entire separate environment in
Hmm.
order to contribute, and so getting involved was just too many steps for most people. Well, with Homebrew, I was like, hey, look, you type in one command, and I try to do all the work for you. And if it doesn't work, then all we have to do is tweak it a little bit, and here's the commands, and then submit a pull request, and poof, you go. So yeah, that really drove this enormous graph contribution, which helped drive the growth of the project in general. And it's a system that other people have copied over the years, and I'm glad. I think that it's something that most projects should try and do, like the idea of using fork graph in that way. But yeah, we got companies contributing for sure. I remember the first time we had an at apple.com PR, and we're like, oh
Mm.
wow, Apple know about the project. and like Nvidia and Facebook, and it really has at this point become like the de facto way. Still surprises me when I open up a new dev tool website. It's like brew install, and I'm like, oh yeah, that thing.
Well, let me ask, how involved are you in the project now? Have you basically handed the reins to other people as you've moved on to new projects?
Yeah. So I really nurtured other contributors initially. I don't think any of them truly recognized that at this point. Yeah. But I always like when I saw people like getting involved with the guts, I would jump at their issue or pull request and help them along and you know listen to what they had to say and say why I disagreed or agreed. Um, just trying to get them in there, and then I'd give them like collaboration access as soon as they seemed to want it. So it was easy for me to step down from like working on it full time, which was probably like 2016, and so up until that point, like my career had been like when Homebrew became successful, I quit the job and worked on Homebrew until I ran out of money, and then I got another job, and I got to say for the first few months I was working mostly on Homebrew, and I like to say that I had like two full-time jobs because it was basically like that. I was early 20s. I didn't need anything apart from like the satisfaction of the work I was doing. So I'd work on the job I had, and then go home and work on Homebrew and work on weekends and holidays, and I loved it. Honestly, it was great. But yeah, I can work on it full time for very long. Like there was never a long stretch. And so by about 2016, the project was, as far as I was concerned, what I set out to achieve. And I was tired of the burnout of it. And so I stepped down like quite formally, handing over the repo to the Homebrew organization that we created on GitHub. Because it was on my username for like all that time, 7 years. So like one of the, I think it was still top of that. Maybe, but like, it finally got replaced by Twitter's Bootstrap at some point.
Oh,
That's
interesting.
the top project. So whenever they released that, I can't remember. So yeah, like one of the top projects from GitHub, like my name, my username there. Like I was overly fond of that, and so I remember the time there was it was a Christmas party at this place I was working part time, and I showed my manager like the page of GitHub where you can transfer a repo, and I was having trouble doing it, right, transferring it to the Homebrew organization, and so I asked him if I should do it, and he said, "Max, fuck no," and I was like, okay, and so I went away and thought about it for a few minutes, and I decided that yeah, like if anything, that just was why I should do it because he was like, I would never be able to do this because it's ego based, right? And open source isn't about that. It's about making sure the community has it. So yeah, I pushed the button, and yeah, it was about 2016. And then like I stayed on the governance committee until 2 years ago, but
Okay.
I wasn't very active. The community really was great, and we probably should talk about it at some point. But
Yeah.
if the open source community appears, then the project has legs. It can't be on one person's shoulders forever.
Yeah, I think we saw this with Python as well, right? It was Guido for a long time, and now it's has its own foundation. So, but you were like a one-man army for a long time doing this, so it's a bit of a different
Well,
game. So,
I model myself on Linus, which like he like a bit more controversial nowadays, but at the time he was like he showed how open source could work,
yeah,
right? So he was a benevolent dictator, so I did the same. I ruled with an iron fist, but I listened to everyone, and I tried not to be rude like he was, but I got a bad rep because sometimes I was. Sometimes I was rude.
it
It
happens.
was stressful, and frustrating a lot of the time. And I have very high expectations of quality, which is difficult to enforce in open source. Although I've developed a lot of strategies for how to do it nowadays. So yeah, like there was a lot of people helping me, but I ran the project, and so it was a lot of mental overhead.
Interesting. Kind of switching gears. So before I forget, I got to ask you about the infamous tweet. That so there's can you explain the tweet for the audience? It's one of those. That's how I came to know about you. Is from something you'd posted. So.
Yeah. So I think it was 2015. Yeah, I think so. I was in between jobs suddenly again, and wasn't sure what to do because what I wanted to do was work on open source, but I needed money, and I didn't really want to go and work for another startup again because it occupies so much of your mental energy. It becomes difficult to work on open source. So my wife at the time said that I should respond. Why don't I respond to one of those Google emails they keep sending you? Because at this point, Homebrew was huge, not as huge as it is now, but big, very big. And Google had been emailing me like every few months for like maybe 18 months, suggesting that I go and interview.
Mm.
But I knew that Google had very computer science centric interviews. And of course, as I've said, I don't have a computer science degree. I have a chemistry degree. I never did computer science. I never really enjoyed looking into it as much as some people do. So I didn't go back and study it or anything. And I haven't really had to interview for anything in this industry. Like, even my first job was based on the open source I'd done. They used it on a day-to-day basis, and they knew that therefore I would make a good hire. So I replied, and I spoke to the recruiter, and he said, "Oh, well, we'll skip the phone interview. We'll have you come straight here." And I said to him, "I don't have a computer science degree, right? You're not going to ask me a bunch of computer science questions. I can answer questions on open source and software architecture, engineering, managing large software teams, things like that. These are my skills." And he said, "Oh, yeah, the interviewers know," which they probably did. So I got there, and my first interview of the day, 8:30 or 9 or whenever they start, was the question from the tweet, where I was asked to invert a graph on the whiteboard, and so I gave it my best shot because I worked with data structures like that before, and I had an idea about how I might do it. But after about 20 minutes, she just stopped me and said, she's like, "Okay, well, let's just give up on this." And I asked her if she ever used such graphing structures, and she was like, "Oh, all the time." And I was like, "Well, what team do you work on?" And she was like, "Google Photos." I was like, "Okay." The rest of the day was better. Certainly, some of the interviewers understood, what I built and what I was good for, and asked me questions about that. And I left thinking that I probably hadn't got it. And then about I don't know, a week later, they phoned to tell me I hadn't got it. And I was expecting this, right? But as soon as they put the phone down, I just had this moment of rage. And I was like, I couldn't believe that there was no way they could place me inside Google, right? Like, nothing that I could do. Even if it was just like make Homebrew more appropriate for Google or maintain it in a way that worked for their systems. Because I knew a lot of people at Google used this software. So I wrote the tweet, which is, I believe, 90% of our engineers use the software you wrote, in brackets Homebrew, but you can't invert a binary tree on a whiteboard, so F off. And it was just like this momentary, venting rant, get it out there tweet. I had maybe 600 followers at the time, so I didn't expect anyone to notice it. And then a lot of people noticed it.
How many followers did you have a month later? That's the question.
23,000.
Good job.
Yeah. It was an insane couple of days. So I was actually teaching iPhone development at the time, part-time, and I wrote the tweet, went and taught a lesson, and then at the first break, about an hour and a half later, my friend was like, "Max, you're at the top of Hacker News." I was like, "For what?" He's like, "That tweet you wrote this morning about Google." was like, oh crap. So I opened up my Twitter and just insane like attention. I don't know if either of you had ever had a viral tweet.
No,
Like
I've
the
had posts go
not like
experience.
viral
that.
before. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like for me, this one was I would scroll the notifications page and then it would be immediately another whole page. And then I could just keep doing that for minutes at a time. So it was interesting. Like I got a few at replies from like other software developer heroes of mine, which firmly made it clear that you shouldn't hero worship people because they weren't nice. A lot of them. Um, one guy in particular that I really admired his work, and he was like, "You should probably go and learn some computer science." So I'm like, "Oh God!" And Hacker News was obviously mixed about it. But apparently, it caused a wave at Google. Like, I had friends at Google, and they told me that they had like a number of town halls about the tweet,
Oh wow.
and
Oh, that's funny.
it made them like revisit their interviewing process. Apparently, I don't know what happened, and I got more than 300 recruitment emails from
Nice.
just about every company that was significant in the Valley at the time, including SpaceX and Square, and even Google, right? Another department at Google emailed me and said, "Hey, Max, we know that you're really good at these things, and we would like to have you come back, interview with us. We'll give you an interview that's appropriate, and if you like, we don't agree with the fact that the other team didn't hire you." So, you know, it was nice. But one of those emails, recruitment wise, was Apple, and that's where I went.
Very cool.
It reminds me a bit of what's it called, Joe? The Brown M&M test or something like that. The fact that they told you that they would do this interview a certain way and didn't.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, remind us what that is, Joe. You usually.
Well, the Brown M&M test, right? So there's a band called Van Halen back in the day.
Yeah.
You're an '80s kid, so you know them.
Yeah.
But I guess their contract writer said that all brown M&Ms have to be removed from the bowl in the green room. So they'd look actually, and they would see that if there were brown M&Ms, they probably didn't read the rest of the contract or the writer. So, and the stage could be really dangerous as a result. So that was a litmus test that Van Halen had used. So, in much the same way with with the interviews and stuff, I guess, right? If they're going to do the old bait and switch, we promise not to ask you dumb questions except for the one we just asked you. Then is what it is. But that's interesting. And I think with open source too, kind of a bring it back to that. I mean, so you had written Homebrew wildly successful, and still had to go get a job, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't enough to support you
Oh, no.
by any means, right? So,
Well, when I started in open source, the very idea of money and open source was antithetical.
right.
Like organizations like GNU felt that money was evil and that software needed to be pure. And so that attitude was still pretty prevalent. So even once Homebrew became successful, the idea of trying to monetize it or appeal for donations was still felt wrong. But it was also the era where commercial open source started. And I remember NPM turned up, a few years after Homebrew. And then I forget the guy who made it, but he figured out how to get some funding for it. And that was the first project I'd ever heard of that did that.
Interesting.
And then I think the same day that happened, some VC somehow got my phone number and phoned me up and was like, "Hey, can we do something similar with Homebrew?" And I told him it was too late. And the truth was, I stand by that the community that had built up around Homebrew would have been appalled if we tried to turn it into a standard company. You can't, it would be like a bait and switch, just like you were saying. And so I declined, which I guess means I'm a good person.
What is your opinion more broadly on building companies around open source? I certainly have some opinions, but I'm curious to hear yours.
Yeah, well, I wanted to do it, right? before I had the idea for Tea, my current company, I wanted to try and build a commercial open source company because it seemed like a great way to be able to work in open source, but also, make a living out of it. But I hope what we're building is going to be a better solution. And the reason I think commercial open source isn't necessarily great is because commercial and capitalism in general, there's a lot of incentives there towards things that aren't what open source is about. Open source is this wonderfully evolutionary thing where what is the best solution for a problem just naturally ends up slotting into that gap. And the community then makes sure it continues to satisfy those needs. They're not driven by commercial imperatives on the side. So once they're there, it is the people who use it that decide how it continues to be. And that's very important considering open source holds up the whole internet nowadays.
Right.
Like this wonderful thing, well, mostly wonderful, certainly my opinions of how the internet's turned out. We could have an entire couple of hours on, but it still is a force for good. And it needs to be maintained and run in a way that is as close to the open source ideal as possible, which is part of the reason that some of these base parts of the internet aren't run by companies still, right? We're still managed to keep it like that.
I think
It
before
seems to me. Go ahead, Joe.
well, I think before we chatted, we were talking about a tweet from FFmpeg, right? Which I'll share here. I think it was
Yes.
kind of highlights a bit of what you're talking about. Let's see here. Yeah, your weekly reminder that FFmpeg powers all online video: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Disney Plus, yada yada yada, all running FFmpeg underneath, right? And I think you brought this up to kind of highlight, I think, one of the issues in the industry, really, which is this is a project, and they have to go out and announce this once in a while. So
yeah, and I love this tweet because it reminds me of how I felt once I'd created open source that was just so big that I couldn't stop working on it. So usually you start these open source projects like because you have an itch or you see something you need to build personally. That's always how it's been for me anyway. Like most of the open source people I know who have just always worked in open source are like that. They just love building the stuff they need and then putting it out there and having other people you find the product market fit as such just by putting it out there. And then sometimes these projects become absurdly huge, and FFmpeg is one, and curl is one, and core.js is one. And at that point you're like, oh, well, this is taking up a huge amount of my time, and but I don't feel I can stop. And there's no systems really to help you work on these things full time. It's kind of sad, really, how much money Homebrew has, for example. It's not enough to pay anyone's salary. And I imagine it's pretty similar for FFmpeg, and that's also absurd. And then, you got OpenSSL and projects like that. Now, some of these projects form foundations, and you got the major open source foundations like Mozilla and Apache, and but they don't have much money either. There isn't really any money. And the solutions people come up with, stuff like sponsorship and bounties, they don't really work. I think we've shown that they don't really work. My GitHub sponsorship currently, and well, admittedly, I haven't made any significantly new open source in a while. I got a few other big projects, but yeah, I get $7 a month.
nice.
Oh, wow. Well, even the bounties, sometimes it's like, oh, we'll pay you $5,000 to fix this issue. And it's like, that's great, but my salary, if I took a job, would be $400,000. So I'd have to have a lot of bounties to make up for a salary and then, run my own business. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, I tried a Patreon for a bit, which is kind of similar in that I was trying to create content which would encourage people to sponsor me in that manner. And I found that after a few months, I didn't have much. I think I got up to $800 a month. and my rent was 1,500. So, and I was spending 30-40% of my time just marketing myself, trying to build up that online presence. You'd think I wouldn't need to with Homebrew under my belt and everything, but like open source doesn't create celebrity, really. as we were saying, like I got 23,000 followers on Twitter because of my tweet, not because of my work.
Hey, rage works.
Yeah. And as a result, most of my followers just want me to hate on Google the whole time, honestly, rather than talk about open source. And bounties, yeah, they encourage projects to cater to these people who can afford the bounties, and like they have an agenda, basically. And like, yeah, it's great when it's a bug fix, but when it's like a feature, then they're pushing that project in a direction, and that's against the open source philosophy. That's not why open source works. So yeah, I don't like bounties.
Well, and I mean, there are other ways to push a project in a direction. To my mind, for example, the development of containers basically at Google for their internal use cases, and then saying, here, community, we don't want Linux to get out of sync with what we're using internally because it's going to cause us big headaches. So here you go, take the code. And then that turns into Docker, that turns into Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is they contributed the talent to make that happen.
Yeah, well, that's a good example of how companies are contributing to open source. And, I don't want to act like they don't. I know Google and Facebook, Microsoft, but all these companies have a lot of open source being generated nowadays. Although, like React is great, right? But it would have been better if the open source community had built that. And because I don't trust Facebook, do you? Do you trust Google?
They're great. I'm kidding.
But that's the nature of it. We've moved into this era where open source is used by Web 2 on a huge scale, and the community works for Web 2. Well, when I got into it, yeah, like people work for these companies, but a lot of what they were working on was things they needed on a day-to-day basis. The company didn't even know about it. The company didn't know they were using this open source that this employee had created and was putting out there. And I remember there were like lawsuits about that kind of stuff when big companies like IBM started realizing that all this open source was creeping into their infrastructure because the employees would do it like partly at work, partly in their own time. It was problematic.
Interesting. Want to take some questions from the audience real quick? Let's see here. Sorry, people just reach. Oh, sorry. Jesse Anderson asks, the Apache Foundation prefers community over code. Where do you fall in that?
I think without community, open source completely fails. So I basically agree with it. Like, open source doesn't start without something quality. The code quality is less important than the quality of the product overall. Right? I'm definitely one of those people that doesn't really care about the quality of the code initially. So check out my code; it's pretty good. But like, the important thing is the contribution. So if the code quality of the contribution ain't great, nowadays I just merge it without like battling it, and then I go back in and fix up the code.
Oh, interesting.
Because I'm far more interested in getting someone to contribute and then maybe contribute again and then participate and build a community that is decentralized, that's expanded beyond me. Because, yeah, it can't survive unless a community emerges and then buoys it up and takes it to the next level. Homebrew, yeah, like it was very easy for me to pass it to the community because it had grown into a very strong one with people who cared passionately about the project and wanted it to succeed, which I'm very proud of.
How do you know that you have a strong community?
I think passion is definitely a part of it, right? Like I would turn up to new issues and find that someone in the community had already replied with a detailed response that was as good or close to what I could have said as the person who should know the code and the goals of the project better than this contributor. When you start seeing that, you know that you're building a strong community.
Was there a moment when other people started to know the code base better than you? I assume at this point that's probably true if you've stepped away from it.
Oh, it's definitely true now. And no, I don't want to shit on Homebrew at this point, but like, it's a very, very large code base nowadays. Because I've been back in there recently, because I was trying to write like a compatibility layer for something else, and I was lost. I had to use some AI tooling to help me like find things. It's very big now. So yeah, there's definitely a point where the community has taken over the project to the point where you don't recognize parts of it. But if you know, I think it's very important for projects to have a leader initially. Very important. And yeah, I learned that from Linus and from working on lots of other open source projects. Like the first set of open source projects I got involved in was KDE, which is this desktop environment for Linux. And I saw how messy a bad leadership structure can lead. And like, so some bits of it were very well led and they were successful, and some bits of it were poorly led and they were floundering. So you've got to have a strong leader initially to like shape that community. And if you do that, then you'll find that the code that people contribute matches the code style that you've already picked. And as a result, you can continue to work on the new bits. But yeah, eventually I stepped down. I handed it to my friend Mike McQuaid, who I met during the KDE days. He turned up very quickly in Homebrew's history and volunteered to participate. He wrote to me and said, "Can I participate?" And I'm like, "It's open source, mate." Of course you can. And then he's still the core maintainer today. He stuck with it and took it over when it became less the kind of thing I was interested in doing it. He's really more of what we would call a maintainer than I am. I like to create and then get it going and then step down.
I'm just looking at it too. It's a Ruby project, which is interesting. So I'm looking at a Rails, which is the other popular Ruby project, and the number of commits for Homebrew is like almost 400,000 commits. Rails is comparatively 88,000. That's insane because Ruby is one of those languages where it's popular, but it's not like JavaScript or something widely used. So that's really interesting too, because I think it's one of the projects that probably keeps the Ruby community going, if I'm not mistaken, or if I take a guess.
Probably.
Yeah.
So there's some history to it, right? I chose Ruby because I wanted Homebrew to just work from a Git clone on Mac. And so at the time, Mac came with Ruby, PHP, and Perl. So I hadn't done any Ruby before, but I've been hearing all these great things about Ruby because of Ruby on Rails. So I picked Ruby and discovered that I actually love Ruby, and I kind of miss working with it. It's something beautiful about it. I don't know if you feel the same.
It's fun. It's fun to program in. I used to be a Rails developer back in the day.
I never did any Rails. I wish I had. Yeah, with Ruby, I'd spend like hours just like taking some code I'd written and trying to make it more beautiful, and it was very satisfying. Although I think as a result, Homebrew developers other than me hated my code. I do some crazy things, and they'd be like, "What?" I still do crazy things. I got some strange codisms in my new projects that occasionally my staff say, like, "Max, what are you doing?" Or they say things like, "I didn't even know you could do this with TypeScript." And that from my senior dev the other day. He's been a developer longer than me. I'm like, "Yeah, well, it's an expression." So yeah, like part of the reason Homebrew was successful is because we did it with Ruby. Because the first major influencer to find Homebrew was a Ruby on Rails developer. And that was the moment that Homebrew went from being this niche project barely anyone knew to being on the road to success.
Interesting. You want to talk about tea real quick? We got 20 minutes left. We haven't really talked about this, but I think it's a cool project. So nerding out on it over the weekend, poking around it. It's cool. What is it?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I was in between jobs and trying to figure out how I could maybe do open source full time again. As I say, I tried a Patreon a few years back, and I admire people like Sindri Soros, who he's one of the biggest open source developers of all time. I think at this point, he's got 600 packages in Node, and he
Holy
makes a
crap.
living from open source. Yeah, like pretty much every major Node project from near the beginning. And also, he's a Mac guy, and he loves Swift, and so I really like the guy. And he always, well, over the years, he managed to get it so that he makes a living off open source. And so I admired what he did, and so I know it's possible, but I was thinking about how sponsorships and bounties aren't really the way. Like sponsorships make open source into a charity, and open source is fundamentally infrastructure now, right? Didn't used to be. We wanted it to be, and then over the period that Web 2 came to exist, it became like what everyone builds on top of. So I knew there must be a solution, and so I reached far into my research, trying to figure out what I could do about it. And I looked into crypto, and I discovered smart contracts, and I discovered how, for example, on OpenSea, if you sell an NFT, because this was the height of the NFT craze, and 10% of the sale price goes back to the original creator. And that's a smart contract. You can't get around it. It happens automatically in a decentralized, distributed fashion. You don't need a centralized body of people keeping track of where the money has to go, or an organization or anything. You put that out on the internet and it runs itself. I was like, wow. Because I had this moment of realization about the nature of package managers and how they understand all these little graphs of dependencies between across the entire thing. Like there's millions and millions of open source projects, and the package managers that understand the route through all of that, so that you get a kind of like trust system that's built up and a path through which you could effectively channel a cryptocurrency or a token. So I phoned up one of my friends who's been in crypto for ages and trying to get me in it for ages, and I always was like, I don't. It's interesting, I'd read the Bitcoin white paper. I merged Bitcoin into Homebrew back in the day and never ran it, like an idiot.
Oh, interesting.
Like one of my biggest regrets could have been a 50 block reward right near the beginning when it was easy. Actually, I'm not entirely sure how long after its release that was, but yeah. And he'd been trying to get me into it, and I told him the idea, and he was like, "Okay, I'll call you back." And then he found all these VCs who were like trying to throw money at me, basically. So it was very easy to raise. Turns out, like a lot of people think this is one of the first legitimate uses for crypto and blockchain tech. So we did build a package manager. I did build the package manager, which we build initially as like Brew 2, and now I've moved away from that because I never wanted to build another Brew. Like I don't like revisiting things, and so what I actually built is more like MPX for everything. It's not really a package manager, so yeah, we built that, and like part of it is going to relate with what we're building with the T protocol. But as we built out the T protocol, we came to realize that there's loads of different package managers, and we need to support all of them, not just one. So we built out this protocol which is designed to reward open source developers by understanding this value network. Like, open source is enormous, and it has this implicit understanding of what is important and what's not. So we built out this system that understands how to rank open source, and thus, once it's live, token that is inserted into that system automatically channels to all open source projects, all the way through the chain, even the ones that normally you've never heard of, or you maybe don't even know are in your stack. Because it's pretty typical, right, to have like 6,000 dependencies in a typical Node application now. We understand the dependency tree all the way down to libc. So go through Node, go through OpenSSL, go through libatomic, down to libc. And anything staked into that system, a percentage of the rewards that are generated is always funneled to the open source projects, and then their dependencies, and then their dependencies, all the way down. It's
How did those rewards come about?
so this is one of the reasons you can only do it with crypto. Like we've tried to fund open source with traditional models. We needed something completely new, and well, with crypto, you can just create token out of thin air. So every 48 hours or so, we create some token out of thin air, and then we distribute it to the people that are staking into that system. We call it steeping, because it's not strictly staking. And to the projects that they are steeping against, and then all the dependencies.
Interesting. What's been the uptake on this so far?
A lot of interest from open source devs who understand crypto. A lot of scathing hate.
Oh, interesting. Tell us more.
Well, so I released the package manager last November, and it got straight to the top of Hacker News, and then Hacker News locked the article and took it down.
They took it down. They didn't just
What?
lock it.
Yes. Well, they took it down from the board. It's still there. You can find the link. So it lost its ranking. And the justification was simply that anything crypto gets deleted from Hacker News now.
Interesting.
And, a lot of people won't use the package manager because they think that it's a scam because of the crypto aspect. So it's disheartening. But people who actually work in open source are very optimistic and hopeful that this is a solution for them, especially the ones who are better about crypto. Those who aren't sure about crypto are very quietly optimistic about it. And obviously the crypto and blockchain and protocol communities, who I've discovered remind me an awful lot of the open source communities that I initially got involved in back in 2004. So it has the same vibes. They're very excited. So reception, it's going to be, the proof will be in the pudding for it.
Mm-hmm.
We'll release this thing, and it'll be clear, because we're releasing these smart contracts out in the open. You'll be able to read them. That we as a company are not taking like some percentage of open source. We're not like taking a fee or we're not taking like a cent every time you install Node or anything like that. Hopefully thus giving legitimacy to us and the project. It's not a scam. It's not something that's trying to rug pull like a community or make money off the back of open source. This is something that is trying to support the open source ecosystem by trying new ideas, because we've tried the others and they haven't worked.
Interesting. With blockchain, we were talking about this earlier. I mean, you mentioned this is one of the first legitimate uses of blockchain that
that's what people say.
That's what people have been saying. Yeah,
I'm sure there is some others, but
how do you overcome that baggage, though, right? Because I mean, crypto is definitely one of those areas right now where it's a bit dirty-ish.
Yeah. Tell us about crypto scams. What's your outlook on crypto scams?
Yeah. So, well, I was like with most people. I just assumed crypto was mostly scams and nonsense. It was interesting, but it didn't seem to be producing anything of value. So I get where everyone's coming from with it.
Yeah.
I really do. And since working in it, I gotta be honest, there's more scams than I thought.
Wow.
We need projects like Tea to show that there is utility and use for this technology, because it is just a set of technologies, and because it's money related, I think it's had more scams than usual. Like, I do like to talk about how email, when it first came out, nobody knew what to do with it, and then the first people who really figured out what to do with it were the scammers. And it was a long time before email became something that was more utility than just sort of a nice idea, and overcame the scam part. But look at your junk folder today. Like, it's still full of scams. We just figured out how to keep those scams away from people as much as possible. But people get scammed all the time. My neighbor got scammed the other day from a phishing email. I remember a few years ago I got phished because my Netflix subscription was, my credit card was expiring very soon, and Netflix emailed me to say that my credit card payment had failed. So I was expecting stuff like that, and as a result, filled everything out. And then right at the end, I looked at the URL bar, and I was like, "Oh my god!" So, email's still full of scams, but we've managed to find the utility there. So I think it's the same with crypto. Like, we'll start to see that there is genuine utility. Like, smart contracts are a real game changer for what's possible. Yeah, we're hoping projects like Tea will show that in the next cycle, which, it's happening.
Yep. You can see a path of enlightenment or something like that after the trough of disillusionment or whatever it is. So I find real utility in the technology, right? So I'm bullish on crypto long term. I think it's got utility, but again, it does attract a lot of tech bros in Miami and places like that. So
yeah,
but
yeah, it does. For sure, but there is a surprising number of real builders in the space. I went to ETH Denver in February, and I wasn't sure what to expect, but I got there and I just met a lot of really cool people that were passionate about what they were building and loved working on it. And, like, they hoped that they would back a project that worked out, but it wasn't why they were doing it. It was just like a coincidence as such. They believe in some of the tenets of the technology, like decentralization or governance, creating utility, and not just the idea of digital money and what you could do with that.
Right. So what do you think's next for open source? Kind of zoom out 5 years from now. What do you think? What do you think happens?
I'm genuinely hoping that what we build with Tea enables people to do open source full time. Like, I have worked on open source part time for 20 years, and I've managed to build like Homebrew and a number of other like significant open source projects. What would I have done if I'd been able to work on it full time? And it's got to be the same with like other people in the space. But also, I'm hoping that, like, we got all these talented programmers working in big Web2 companies. I'm hoping that they'll see what they can do with the T protocol and understand that they could potentially quit their, lucrative careers at these Web2 companies and stop applying their talents to making ad algorithms and like gaming people's dopamine with likes. Like, it's just terrible use for talent, like such a terrible use, when open source literally has catapulted us into the modern era. Like, if anything, we're behind. Like, we're stagnating what we are able to do in software and the internet, just like Microsoft did with Internet Explorer 6 back in the day.
Interesting.
I also hope that every open source project forms like what's called a DAO on our protocol.
Right.
Essentially formalizing like their community governance using smart contracts on our blockchain. And we're going to encourage this, right? Like, every project that onboards to the T protocol will have to have a wallet. And we're going to encourage the wallet to be the address of a smart contract for the project's DAO, which is a decentralized autonomous organization. So, a bad name, honestly, for it, but the idea of like solidifying how the governance of a project works on chain with smart contracts, and then allowing participants to vote on changes to those smart contracts using the token that they hold as voting rights, essentially. It will just take community governance for open source to the next level.
That's really cool. Well, awesome. I know we're coming up on time here. I guess for people who want to learn more about you and Tea and everything else, how can they do that?
So best place, probably tea.xyz. That's our domain. If you want to learn more about the protocol, then sign up for the email list. The next few weeks are going to be very interesting in terms of like our announcements of how things are going, because we're gearing up for our testnet at the end of this year. And certainly open source, if you maintain any open source, there is no reason not to follow the project and then onboard to the testnet. It's going to be you just click a few buttons and then you'll be able to see how the T protocol works for your project, how we've ranked it. What we use for ranking is something similar to Google's PageRank, and we call it T rank. And so we pre-computed a lot of open source. I think it's like 30 or 40 million projects at this point. And we'll be running an Oracle on chain that updates that on a regular basis to determine where a token gets distributed. And so like as a project owner, you can just sign up and see what happens. Completely free and just interesting. And if you're interested in the package manager, then that's on GitHub, github.com/tea.xyz/cli. I think it's great. A lot of people think it's great too. It's a new kind of tool, and I'll be releasing version 1 of it soonish, where I've changed a few things. So it's worth checking out. It's neat.
Very cool. Very cool. Put some links in the show notes here. So awesome. Well, thanks for your time, man. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. I learned a ton. And yeah, big fan of Homebrew from back in the day. So shout out for that again. I think all of us are fans. So definitely thanks for your contributions there. So anything going on, Matt?
Let's see. We have a couple of conferences coming up. I believe we were both going to be at Big Data London, and I believe you're going to be giving a talk there. Is that correct?
Yeah, keynoting there, and we're on a panel together. And that's what next week after. Yeah, the 20th and 21st in
20th
London.
and 21st. So. That's right.
Yep.
Yeah. And then I'll be in Budapest for Crunch Conference. My talk there is October 6th. If anyone is interested in attending, I can give you a discount code. Just shoot me a message on LinkedIn. What else is coming up? We have a data engineering workshop on October 26th in Chicago. We'll be running together.
Yeah, go to. Yep.
Yeah. So check that out. We again, send us a message if you're interested. We can send you some info on registration, and there are already some posts on that on LinkedIn.
Yep. I'm speaking a lot of places this fall, so travel schedule is absolutely insane. Let me see. Next week we have Amit Prakash from ThoughtSpot. He's the CTO and co-founder of ThoughtSpot, so that's gonna be a fun chat. And anyway, fun times. We'll be dropping this as a podcast too, so check it out on Spotify and all the other fun podcast platforms. So awesome. Well, Max, again, thanks for being on the show. Great talking to you. So
great.
Thanks to the audience out there.
Thank you for having
happy Labor Day. All right. See you, everybody.